James, like, you have an enterprise asset management team spread across, 3 locations. Then you have a maintenance team. Then you have an FM team, which is an external team. Uh, how do you drive these teams to follow like the KPI of experience, asset uptime, asset quality uptime? Like if you were to pick like one technique here and one chain of thought, how do you do that?
Yeah, so we have, as a MAG group, have rewritten the standards from the very, very start. So part of that stewardship program was redefine the baseline of how we're going to operate as MAG. And we've essentially written out 20 stewardship steps that go from everything from implementation, how you'd measure a leading measure, how do you do a lagging measure, where does that data sit, how do you create a work order. So all of this now is in a very structured approach where we'd brought a specialist company to come and work alongside us to deploy us our stewardship process. That alone, though, just writing a standard is not enough. So the other big piece of work that we're still working through now is that cultural change and working with cultural specialists to help us understand and get our teams to come along on that journey with us and have that continuous improvement mindset of if it does not work, then get around the table, let's figure it out and fix it. So the fail fast approach is very, very important as you adapt to a new structure. Because as you write it down and as you sign off those standards, and me and the other 2 directors that work in across Manchester and Stansted, we would collectively sign them off. That does not mean that's set in stone forever. That is a point in time that is, we believe, is 80% correct. There could be 20% to finesse, but the only way you learn off those standards is implementation and deployment, and then listening to your teams that say, "Hey, this, the way we've done this doesn't make sense," and that is the journey of asset management and stewardship, is continually assessing what you have and finessing that data. Very much the same as what you do to an asset. If you maintain it and you carry out that maintenance, you'll find better ways of doing it. You'll find things that are improving on that asset. Should be no different to your standards. If there's a better way of doing it, and it's changing probably more rapidly now with the implementation of AI, than we have done in many years, because there's automations that are coming in to help us to get into that position quicker or have the insights available to you sooner.
Now, you talked about this a little bit, James, like, you documented your enterprise asset management procedure at the Manchester Airports Group. But at a system level, in terms of, at Rolls-Royce, Maximo was at an earlier version, but with better data, and it worked better than a new system with, not so accurate data, let's say. What were the specific techniques around software or software usage that you adopted that helped your team to improve the quality of the data that you now have in Maximo?
Yeah, so again, it comes back to the fundamental setting down the standards. So when we agree as a group, what do we mean when we define something as a criticality 5, all having a common approach and a common agreement? If I had a system that I would deem to be really critical to me, but then Manchester and Stansted scored that completely differently, when we try and look at this at an enterprise level, you cannot do that, because what you then have is disjointed opinions that we need to fix with a factual database that says, here's your control measures that mean that is the end score of that asset. The other thing is, we collectively agreed what our parent-child structure would be across the group. And we all went back through our data and reassessed it to bring it up to the same standard. So a large amount of work, probably about 2 years of work actually, to go through our assets. We stripped out 40% of redundant or old assets that were noise in the system. And actually one thing we found was when we did that, other things started to come to life. So where we had poor training on the system, so if I had a control room, they would always use a certain asset because they believe that they were recording it against the right asset, but actually that asset was a do not use asset, and therefore it shouldn't have been in the system. It was rogue. We got rid of it. Similarly, one of the big risks you have if you try and enterprise and deploy which I saw at East Midlands Airport, was when I joined, it said that I had 3 terminals and 2 runways. I haven't got that at East Midlands Airport, but I do have that at Manchester. And what was apparent was that there was copied and pasting going on. So
Sure.
very, very important that you upload your data correctly at the first point, but then
Sure.
just as important to do an asset verification in a set period of time. So go and walk the
Sure.
site and go and touch the assets, make sure they're there. Now we were able to
Sure.
do that because we just implemented new asset tags, which had QR codes on it, had various sort of information in there, so that as we move into our mobile journey, that I can digitally enable people to walk around the site, scan a QR code, raise the fault, and have a far better process in place, so that as somebody who's raising a fault, it's a seamless process. Now, if you don't make it seamless, typically what you'll find is people will stop raising faults because it's too difficult. And therefore, you're missing all that information about mean time between failure, because you don't truly know when did it fail and when's it back in place.
Absolutely.
And how often is it failing? So fundamentals have to be in place, but also you have to simplify the systems so that it is easy for everybody to use moving forward.
Absolutely. You talked really about the Maximo's use at Mag and its effectiveness with its new version, James. Like, how satisfied are you with Maximo? If you were to pick up like 3 things that are not quite working well for you in the current setup, what would those 3 things be?
Yeah, I guess the 3 things that I want to improve in Maximo: core training. Still, I think we're still not where we want to be with our training, and therefore we see discrepancies coming in. So, a bugbear of mine is if I see somebody raising or reporting in the PCR code, in the problem cause remedy codes, of default. I want to ban default because that doesn't give me the data, doesn't tell me what's happened or why. The next bit, which at East Midlands we're almost leading the way a little bit on, is the implementation into Maximo Monitor. I'm a big believer in that the future of our assets are going to be digitally connected and tell us more than we know today, but also retrospectively allowing me to install sensoring technologies to understand the failure mode. That today, even I don't necessarily want to pay a third party to hold my data and then API it in. I could do that. But my knowledge and background experience have been able to test engines and understand the failure modes across. If I think of the latest test bed that Rolls-Royce had built, which I was part of, that can read 10,000 parameters. That's 10,000 individual lines of data in every single engine test. You have to, now arguably that could be too much, and actually you've got to be careful not to read too much data. But
Sure.
If you think of an asset on the ground here, how do I just understand the vibration of the asset or electrical current? And there's some really, really great systems out there, and I've seen, go to many engineering shows and talk to many specialists of what they have available to them. The bit that I'm really keen to do is how do I own my own raw data, so I can start to use Maximo Monitor, but also AI models to start to interrogate and understand when has an asset gone out of condition and triggered an alarm or an alert or a work order to go and do something. So it's really looking at how do we integrate better. And I think that's one thing that IBM, I know, are working on, and we're working closely with them on, but a bit of a little bit more pace in that space would be great. And then really finally is having this all wrap up together. So as we talk about our CapEx plans, and when we look across the CapEx plans, and we as I mentioned before, we've got a very large asset base, a very high cost asset base. How we optimize those plans is key. So having the right data to enable us to make the right decisions on when to retire an asset or when to replace an asset is really where you start to gain your value. And I think that's the bit where the tool today is almost there, and there's some really good features within Maximo coming, but we're again still in the fix the raw data, make sure that you're collecting the right condition data to enable us to have the right outcome in those algorithms to say, okay, so asset X is now wearing out, and its mean time between failure is increased 20% over the last 3 months. Therefore, if we extrapolate and predict that out, we're going to have a failure mode in whatever date, and therefore that could be a critical failure. So kind of really trying to build the picture up to help us make the right decisions on when we swap an asset is
Sure.
the next bit, which we're still sort of battling our way through. But I am confident we'll get there. It's just the when, I guess, is the whole bit.
Sounds very exciting. Sounds very exciting.